I'm Martin Wedderburn. I'm a transport planner by trade. Wedderburn Transport Planning. We're also part of the Oval Partnership, which is an architecture and master planning practice based in Hong Kong. And I've been a long-standing Urban Design Group member as well. And I was asked to talk about forecasting pedestrian activity by Robert. And when I heard about forecasting, I was like, oh, I'm not quite sure. I spent a lot of my time criticising other transport planners for spurious accuracy. As a profession, we tend to sort of forecast 2036 and say there'll be 726 vehicles, 0.32 on that road. We ignore any sort of uncertainty, and some of it's based on very dubious underpinnings. So if I veer into the territory of spurious accuracy, please stand up in pirate fashion and splash me over the head. That's what I'll say at the beginning. I'm going to talk to you about something called Footflow, which is essentially a tool and some metrics. And I hope that it's something that will become part of your tool set as urban designers over the course of the next 2 years. It's essentially 2 metrics. And I say at this point there are other tools that do some of these metrics, so it's not going to be a massive sales pitch. I'll try and talk about some of the principles of what it does. But there are essentially 2 metrics, and the first one is pedestrian accessibility. The simple question of where can I get to within easy walking distance from here. And we've been talking about creating walkable communities, well, for the last 2 days, and it frequently comes up. It's a very simple question, actually, a very simple thing to measure. There are lots of open source and free tools to measure distance and time-based measures of how can I get to places. The key question is about the quality of those data inputs, the consistency of them, and our understanding of the walking network. I talk a lot about the functional pedestrian network. I've worked in that field for 20 years. The way we represent that also influences our outcomes. And the second key metric is footfall itself. Simply how many people walk past a given point at different times of week. Obviously important when we look at the structure of urban settlements, but also how we can optimise footfall for certain businesses or other community facilities that rely on walk past footfall. Footfall can be measured in lots of different techie ways. It tends only to be done in town centre locations, generally. Our approach is slightly different. We're looking at modelling footfall consistently across everywhere, for the reason that we then have a consistent benchmark, not just in town centres, and also so that there can be this predictive or forecasting element attached to it. So what will Footflow be? Just a mock-up. It is essentially a network. It's a functional pedestrian network with the data attached to that network. We're working with a project advisory board and a series of case study partners, and there will be some form of platform by which people will be able to access that data for the existing situation, for a series of footfall metrics and accessibility metrics for those locations. Now, what do we need to achieve that? I mean, one needs to be at a human scale that we as a pedestrian experience. We use a 20-metre segment of footpath as our unit of measurement. So what does that mean in practice? Well, some of you may be staying in the Leonardo Hotel here on the left during your stay. Conveniently opposite the hotel is a row of shops going from a furniture shop at the top to Domino's Pizza at the bottom. That's conveniently almost exactly 100 metres. So that's 5 Footflow segments. And it takes you a little bit over a minute at an average walking pace to walk 100 metres. So what that means is that the difference between the shop at the top and the bottom, there is a difference in terms of places I can get to within 5 minutes. There's also a massive severance effect in front of it. There's also a bus stop in the middle, so the actual pedestrian flows along those 5 segments will be slightly different as well. So this is the level of granularity that we get down to in terms of measuring these metrics. And if you look at that over a wider area, this is Bromley town centre. This is just the residential population density, number of people plotted onto the network. And you can see you start to have areas with no residential population. You have sort of continuous streets, terraced houses that are sort of very equal, and you have sort of speckled effect where you have apartment blocks set back in landscaping and so on. So that's the level of granularity we're working to. You'll also hear me talking a lot about consistency, banging on about it. But when we're talking about policy agenda at the moment in terms of large house building, urban extensions, grey belt, new towns, consistency and having a metric is important. What we have at the moment is your average transport assessment. If you're lucky, you might get a map showing a red site boundary and a few dots saying what you maybe can walk to. Sometimes you just get a little Excel table and it says there is a shop 650 metres away. If it's a relatively reputable transport planning practice, that might be functionally correct. You may have to cross a 3-lane roundabout to get there, but technically you can. That's about as much as we get from most sites nowadays. So, yeah, just to say that the consistency does matter. The world of open data means there's loads of data now. So, for example, OpenStreetMap has this network of routes and paths. It's easily accessible. There's plenty of plugins at which we can use and manipulate this data. And that's great. What I would say is there's an issue about consistency though. So here we have 3 images from Loughborough, Aylesbury and Shoreditch. They all show different residential neighbourhoods and they've been coded in 3 subtly different ways. None of them are wrong. They're all correct. They're all coded by volunteers aiming to emphasise certain different things, but none of them are functionally wrong. Just if we do our analysis through these networks, it shows subtly different results based on the way it's coded. Our principle, therefore, is not to reinvent the wheel, it's to say we adopt open data alongside certain commercial data, but we define what we think is the standard for a functional pedestrian network. We work with the data available to get it to what we think is a consistent standard so that we can benchmark one place against the other. That's the principle we're working to. I wanted to touch on as well something about community engagement as well. We've talked about that. And the first point I wanted to make is that people don't trust renders, with very good reason. And I'm not going to point any fingers. This is a project we worked on, so I'm part responsible for this. Render companies are there to make a visually aesthetic composition. That's their job. Shouldn't be too empty, shouldn't be too full. Typically you should have about 7 people in the foreground with a semi-active function, such as bizarrely a barista pouring the foam on a cafe table in the middle of a plaza underneath a tree with blossom. We see this all the time and no one believes it. And this lady with the boots, she's been at least 3 of our projects, I'm sure, but the public don't trust renders. But do they trust a map? Here we have, Oxford, but I think it's a 2-hour slope. But if I say to the public, there's about 3,000 people an hour or 500 people an hour, do they really engage with that? People have different levels of map reading ability. Do they really understand it? It's maybe not a lot better. What I would argue, though, is that where we have maps, consistent benchmarks, we can start to use places that people know and talk about them. So if I convert this map and I say, well, that dark red is like corn market, people can relate to that. The green relates to one of the side streets, Michael Street, a quieter street. That, despite people can understand. The middle one's more difficult. What does the yellow? Well, it's one of the other parallel streets to corn market. It's Turl Street. It has a level of footfall that is usually someone walking on at any given time. It can just about support some active frontage uses. So we can start to take these footfall bounds and engage about what places might look like in the future by relating them to places that people actually know. So on that note about the future and this predictive element, controversial subject, what could it look like? Well, on the one hand, sticking with Oxford, can be used for some kind of cumulative assessment of strategic sites, for example. We were looking at Oxford West End, and there were 4 big sites that were actually going to affect footfall in the area we're looking at. And it's just a way then of looking at the major changes in footfall that might happen through some of the really big moves that could happen in that area. That's one scale. It can be applied. It can also be applied of comparative, looking at different strategic sites, obviously. And the other is down to that scheme level. I'm going to look at an example of one of the precursor projects to Footflow, which was actually the John Lewis build to rent in Bromley, both Waitrose there. We were taking on board after the design review panel came back with a couple of questions. And one of them was simply, they were closing potentially a sort of horrible little alley behind the supermarket, but it was a public right of way. But they were opening up a new route underneath the flyover over the railway line. And I said, well, how many people might use that? And there, you can come up with an estimate of how many people might use that at a time of day that can inform that discussion. If there are other routes with similar character, again, pedestrian cycle shared path underneath the flyover, you can compare the two. Again, the public, councillors, decision makers, they can start to understand what those forecasts are like. And the other question we got asked, again, the render, this lovely plaza outside the supermarket, what's it going to feel like? It was, again, a render with 7 people or something in the foreground. And we were able to say, there's another plaza just up the street, outside the station, it's really busy, and it will be about a quarter of the pedestrian density of that. I say about a quarter, that's as accurate as we need to get. We don't need to get more accurate. I think that's a good measure. You know that it's going to be not empty. You know that it's not going to have the hustle and bustle of a station environment. You can begin to imagine what that might feel like as a plaza. So that's one use of that prediction to make those kind of judgments without drifting into that needing to give exact down to 3 decimal figures. We typically quote those footfalls ranged in bands rather than individual numbers, I should say. So, looking forward, and at the moment we are developing this for 10 local authority areas in the UK, listed here. If you're working on projects in any of those local authority areas, please speak to us. Subject to a successful funding round next year, we'll be aiming to roll out after March to a national rollout. In the meantime, we are willing to hear from other people who do want case study projects to be looked at. And yes, we have a project advisory board and case study partners we're working with, already with ideas for potential future extensions and so on. That's kind of what we're working on at the moment. So I should just say very quickly at the end, this was developed through a knowledge transfer partnership between the Oval Partnership and Loughborough University, and co-funded by UKRI through Innovate UK. Say that as well. So thank you very much.